the largest happiness study ever done has led to 3 main findings so far. In this video, we're gonna break down this study and I'm gonna give you 3 of the kind of interesting observations and ideas that researchers have found coming out of this first wave of data. Now, the reason we say it's the first wave is because that's one of the things that makes this study unique. So this is called the Global Flourishing Study. I'll include all the references and information down below, but they have over 200,000 participants across 22 different countries. They're using something called a nationally representative sample, which means that there's actually about 22 countries in this that are like, their population is fully represented because they have such a diverse, large sample of people that they're surveying. And finally, I've done other videos, which, you can find on my page talking about like the World Happiness Report that's quite popular. Well, this study is unique in that it's following the same cohort of people across 5 years. So this is just year number 1, but this is again unique because most of these studies might just take like a survey of people at a certain time and try to understand like what leads to their levels of well-being and happiness, etc. In this case, they're doing that, but then they're following those same people over time. So you can actually start to look at causation. Like what happens if someone's life changes, their circumstances change, they get married, someone passes away, they start doing a different job. Like how does that then change their level of happiness or flourishing? So rather interesting. So let's start with what is flourishing. And then again, I'll talk about those 3 insights coming out of this so far. There are really 6 domains in this definition of flourishing. You have health, which is physical well-being. You have happiness, which is sort of your emotional well-being. You have meaning, which is your cognitive well-being. You have character, which is your volitional well-being, which is kind of like virtue and how you engage in the world. You have relationships, which is your social well-being. And you have financial security, which is of course your material well-being. So you can kind of think of it this way. If you're healthy, happy, purposeful, virtuous, social, and financially secure, you probably have a pretty kick-ass life. You're flourishing across the board. And then of course, if you're really struggling in any of these areas, may not be a great picture for you. And so this construct of flourishing is, it's multidimensional. It's really meant to capture across all these different dimensions of our lives when we're really doing well, when we're experiencing a high quality of life. So what have we found so far? Now, the biggest takeaway is that flourishing is really complex and it varies from country to country. It also varies within country and across certain demographics, things like your age, and in some countries there are gender differences. That said, there are 3 initial findings that I think are really important. Number 1, young people seem to be less happy than ever before. Number 2, it seems that increasing economic development, like GDP, this idea of like a first world versus a third world country, that development some ways undermines meaning and relationships and community. Okay, more on that in a second. And number 3, that religious or spiritual practice, especially in a community, is very important for your happiness and well-being and flourishing. So let's start with number 1. So historically, happiness across the lifespan, or we'll call it flourishing across the lifespan, has followed a U-shaped pattern. Okay, so we're thinking like a U-shaped. And what this means is you have your lifespan here. So it's like young people are pretty happy, and then you enter into like your 30s and 40s and it drops down a little bit. And then, around, let's say 40s and 50s, it's kind of at the bottom. And then once you start to retire and get older, it gets up again. This pattern though has shifted across many different countries, and overall the kind of the side of the U shape that's on the young side has flattened out. So it's almost more of like a J shape, or maybe a pattern going up like this, where young people seem to be less happy than ever before. Now there are exceptions to this. I would joke like if you're planning to retire, probably don't move to Poland or Tanzania because their happiness just gets worse and worse every year you get older. And some countries have more complex, nuanced shapes. But generally, again, we see that this cohort of young people ages roughly 18 to 24 are less happy than prior generations. Now, this actually aligns with previous research by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, which we can include down below, and I've talked about before, where he finds that young people, again, are less happy than ever before. Not just they're like kind of less happy, so to speak, but also in instances of mental illness, anxiety, depression, self-harm, all of those are increasing. And you can look up his work. He has a recent book that was very popular called The Anxious Generation, where he breaks this down. But the main issue he highlights is that it's a matter of environment, right? It's just like if you put a seed in soil and you don't give it the right water or nutrients, it's not going to flourish. The same thing is happening for our modern our modern environments when it comes to child development. And he points it out as a shift from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. That is his term. So you can think of a play-based childhood, the way it was historically, being characterized by, rich social connection and time with your friends and building relationships. You had as well a lot more autonomy of, hey, you can go outside and play. And finally, you can kind of engage in the physical world to build something called self-efficacy, which is your ability to manage yourself and to essentially have an impact on your external environment and accomplish things or build things or create things and take that initiative that ultimately builds your self-confidence. When you have a shift to a phone-based or screen-based childhood, you're losing a lot of that engagement in the tangible world that's giving you that sense of efficacy and confidence. You have far less autonomy, so you're losing out on that independence. And finally, you have much more loneliness and isolation with that lack of in-person connection. So that is insight number one. We should need to address the challenges facing our young people. Insight number two, increased economic development may actually undermine some of the more intangible elements that make life worth living. I'm going to actually read the quote from this for a second because this is straight out of that research paper. While many developed nations report comparatively higher levels of financial security and life evaluation, these same nations are not flourishing in other ways, often reporting lower meaning, pro-sociality, and relationship quality. Other, often middle-income nations like Indonesia, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and the Philippines report higher on those more humanistic aspects of flourishing. The more material and the more humanistic forms of well-being sometimes diverge. While purely descriptive, the negative relationship between meaning and gross domestic product per capita is particularly striking and has been confirmed in other previous research. So in other words, standard of living is not the same thing as quality of life. And to break down what he just said there at the end, that there's this kind of inverse pattern where as GDP per capita increases, which is like your economic abundance per person, we see declines in relationships and meaning. And so what we see there is, again, a potential blind spot or a potential problem that as nations continue moving forward with their economic development, there's often an increasing emphasis placed on things like consumption, production, productivity, economic growth, financial status. And while those things are important and they're certainly elements of overall health, they may cause us to overlook some of these things that really matter for life. Things like meaning, a sense of pro-sociality, which is really more of a sense of community and connection to others, and of course the quality of your relationships. All right, third insight, and this one I think is in a way maybe the most important. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the patterns and ideas and data coming out of this analysis were somewhat tentative, right? It's like we see this pattern or we're starting to see this observation and we have some idea here, but this one was quite clear. Religious service attendance supports flourishing. Now, this is really important because I'm not telling you which religion you should believe in or engage with. I'm not telling you what religious community you should participate in. You know, a lot of people, they were maybe raised in a traditional religious setting, maybe Catholicism or something like that, and they grew dissatisfied with organized religion and the big church. That doesn't mean you have to go back to the religion of your youth. Same thing, I spent 4 months living with Zen monks. Probably don't need to do that. Really, the invitation is that you're connecting on some level with this more spiritual dimension of your life and of the human condition, and that you have some group of people or community that you engage with around that topic. So maybe if you're not into religion, if you identify as atheist or agnostic, things you could consider would be maybe a non-religious or interfaith, or even a traditional church, but one that is not so rigid or dogmatic or mired in these kind of traditions, maybe something more progressive. It could be that you do a meditation or mindfulness type center that has weekly practice offerings. Or it could be that you maybe even start a book club, or some small group on Zoom or something, again, where you're just exploring this spiritual or higher dimension of life. Because again, this is just what the research says, that people who engage in these religious service attendances, again, many different countries and cultures here, so it's not just the traditional American image of, going to church on Sunday morning. Okay, it's engaging in these sorts of communities more broadly seems to support our flourishing. So once again, we have these 3 main findings coming out of what to date is really the largest study of happiness. I use the term happiness. The right term would be flourishing, in which happiness is a component, and then you have all those other areas I mentioned, right? You have your health, you have happiness, meaning, character, relationships, and financial well-being. Okay, so we have all those things that help us to flourish. But the 3 main findings are: young people seem to be struggling, and we need to address that to set ourselves up for a better future. Number 2, we may be overlooking some measures of progress when we focus too much on GDP and economic growth. And finally, number 3, that you need to make it suit you and your context, but some religious or spiritual community of practice will go a long way in helping you to flourish. So thanks for watching. As always, on this channel, I try to share the art and science of happiness to help you be at your best. So like, subscribe, do whatever, all those things. And down below, I have a bunch of both free and paid resources in which you can engage to help support this work. So thank you for watching. This has been Jackson Kirchis, and I'll see you next time.